All right, today we're taking a look at the last returning dungeon for the Midnight season that's coming up, Seat of the Triumvirate. This is a little bit of an old school dungeon, not as old school as Pit or Skyreach, but Seat of the Triumvirate was definitely, I would believe, I guess more of a controversial dungeon back in the day. It was definitely difficult. It was one of the lower keys in terms of timed runs back in the day. Very difficult mechanics. This dungeon has mostly been, I would say, has like a good bit of glow up. I'd imagine. But anyways, getting into it, I'm actually going to be sporting the Blood DK this time around. Hopefully my gameplay isn't too embarrassing. But you're going to start off with a lot of these kind of melee mobs in the first pull that are also scattered around the edge. And the way to summon the first boss is by destroying or defeating these couple of Shadow Guard packs. So that's going to be the name of the game here, making sure we have enough percent. Now, by the end of the key, we were actually fairly short, so this is definitely an area where you might want to get more trash count, especially because the pulls can be quite bigger. You can utilize Lust, and the tank damage doesn't feel too heavy. There is a little bit of issues with like the group damage that I noticed. The couple of times I did run this place, it seemed like the healers I was playing with were not struggling to keep people up, but it was definitely depleting mana bars really, really quickly. Now, one thing you might notice is that our mage is currently AFK. He was having some issues staying connected to the game, so we are formatting some of these pulls. So we have these Merciless Subjugators that tend to do a couple of casts, some AoE damage, and then we have these champions that are doing tank damage, and that's kind of it. There's this AoE circle spread out thing we need to do. One thing I'd like to see is maybe a different kind of circle on the ground around these characters, because they are quite difficult to see with the dungeon kind of color palette, which is a little unfortunate. So maybe making that a little bit more vibrant, more either like pink or white. I know they kind of like to keep on the theme of whatever the mob's main school of magic is, but the purple, especially if you're sitting in like the foliage around the room, it's really difficult to see. So that's kind of like my one big gripe, but for the most part, these packs feel pretty good. This is like a cooldown recovery pull before we go into another fairly large pull here. So once again, we'll be gripping in these kind of famished broken mobs. They, if I'm not mistaken, are non-elite, so they tend to die a little bit faster than everything else. So definitely good opportunity for funnel damage for classes that can do that. Things like Ret Paladin, Havoc, DH, etc. But just good sizable pulls. DH and Shadow Priest are both looking fairly comparable when you were looking at the damage meters here. But like I said, the trash in the starting area is actually like pretty chill, nothing too crazy, not a lot of kicks. And when I first ran this place, I was not a fan, but as I've been testing it throughout this week, I'm kind of warming up to Seat a little bit more as I start to get familiar with the trash in here, the pacing, what we can and cannot pull. Anyways, we'll skip a bit ahead here, and so now we are finishing kind of that final pack. Once this pack dies, or at least the Subjugator dies, this is when Zerul or Zeral will spawn, the Ascended, and his mechanics are quite interesting. Now, I don't know, it kind of depends on your comp. This boss could be really difficult or really easy, kind of depending. So he's going to start off with Decimate on a random target. It's going to leave a pool on the ground, do a little bit of damage, nothing too crazy. He has this frontal you'll need to dodge. I can't tell if it targets a tank or a random player. I believe it can be a random player. It's not always on the tank. And then we have Oozing Slam, which is a fairly aggressive AoE damage, which also applies a pretty nasty dot. So that's something for the healer to do. And at the same time, he's going to spawn a couple of oozes. Now, while this is all happening, he's going to be continuing to cast Decimate. So we want to keep the boss away from these ads so that he doesn't connect with them or it does a big burst of damage. Now, luckily, I am playing Blood Death Knight, so I have access to a 90% slow through Death and Decay. So keeping them away, but also keeping them close to the boss without moving too much is good. They also stop traveling if you CC them, so you always have that option to use something like Paralysis or like Hammer of Justice, etc. And that's pretty much the fight. It just does like a casual little rinse and repeats, nothing too crazy. And then once the boss goes down, you are ready to head into kind of the second area of the dungeon, which will have you once again requiring to kill 4 specific mobs to activate the second boss. We are seeing this as a very, very common trend in Pit of Sauron and in this dungeon. Also dungeons in the future like Den of Nalarok. I'm generally not a big fan of these types of objectives, mostly because it feels like it restricts your routing potential. And it'd be really cool if these Rift Wardens were more or less optional, and they might be maybe worth a lot of percent, but they're fairly dangerous. Unfortunately, these Rift Stalkers are probably relatively banned mobs. These Rift Stalkers, as you're going to see a little bit later on, can be quite nasty. They also teleport randomly away and require a kick. And if you don't kick them, they do pretty much full heal, which feels a little aggressive. Now, obviously, the way you counter it is just by kicking them and then they don't heal, or they they barely heal. But yeah, I'm not a fan of mobs that have the potential to full heal or heal for a significant portion of their health. So Rift Stalkers are a little banned, maybe. But also, yeah, just have us on kicks. So our goal right now is to kill these 4 Rift Wardens that are up. There's only 4 in this area, so you have to go to all 4 areas of the dungeon. Now, if anyone remembers back in the day, and maybe I'm incorrect about this, but I remember there being a lot of patrolling mobs that were in stealth. And so you kind of had to memorize the pattern of the patrols, where they might be. It was really easy to accidentally pull if your pacing was either ahead or slow. So they've gotten rid of all that. All the mobs are out in the open from what I can tell, and it's pretty much just get the objectives done to get to the next boss, which is Saprish. These Rift Wardens, also something to note, you cannot pull them more than 30 yards away from these portals or something like that, or they start just erupting doing crazy damage. So you have to tank them close. So if there are packs you're concerned that might pull with the Rift Warden, or you might not want with the Rift Warden, you need to be careful about where you position yourself. Now, I wasn't too certain on how this area was going to feel because the few times I ran it earlier in the week with a different comp, this dungeon, we ended up having like 40 deaths in here. So I was trying to take it slow, pack at a time, see what everything was kind of doing, except the stacking nameplates, or I guess overlapping nameplates, were a little annoying. So a couple of bolts going out, a little bit of melee damage, but outside of that, like nothing too crazy. I also wanted to test out Blood DK. Blood DK has been really fun, or it was fun over the course of alpha. And while they have had some changes, it is a tank that seems to somewhat blast. And when I compare it to the Brewmaster Monk, for example, it seems to do way more damage, which could just be a tuning thing. I say that here as I'm losing threat to the Devourer Demon Hunter. But yeah, BDK feels really good. Of course, the playstyle I am playing Sand Lane, so it's a little bit more kind of straightforward. It's basically Hard Strike and Death Strike spams with some big Blood Boils and Echoes throughout. And so now we're moving on to the 3rd Rift Warden, and then we are going to kind of approach the 4th one here. So I'm going to skip ahead a bit. So here we are approaching one of the final packs right before handling the last Rift Warden. You got to be a little careful of the War Adept. They do some knockbacks, like you just saw there. Of course, if you're paying attention, and I'm bad, like DA would be great for there. I don't have any charges currently. Making sure you keep the Rift Stalkers in, also kicking the bolts. We did have someone go down there. I can't tell if they're just out of range or they DC'd. The Shadow Priest there. Oh no, they're running back. It just looks like they DC'd because it's out of range being on a white class. And so then finally we can move on to the Rift Warden. Honestly, probably could have pulled this onto the Rift Warden. The Rift Essence requires a Dispel and then some spot healing, and then the Rift Hair does a little bit of AoE damage. Nothing too crazy. And then when this boss goes down, you're going to have Saprish, the Ethereum Lord of the Shadow Guard. He does have a little bit of a spawning animation, but outside of that, it's just a 3-target cleave fights. The Dark Fang does a little bit of tank damage. The Shadewing's going to jump around and do Dread Screech. You want to make sure you lock this down with either some range kicks, whether you're a melee DPS or a range DPS. And then these orbs are going to spawn near players. Now the way or I guess on players. Now there's 2 ways to counter this. Of course, in the cheesy way as a DK, you can soak them with AMS or just soak walking through them, or you use this circle mechanic to clear them. So basically you want to drop them as close together as possible, and it's supposed to make getting to the Shadewing maybe a little bit more difficult when it does end up leaping away. Same with the Dark Fang, but you try to stay close to melee when you can, or at least keep your orbs stacked. Now I'd imagine that this fight might change because honestly, this fight does not, at least for me, doesn't feel challenging. Because these orbs, well, you'll see me here just running around with AMS, soaking them up. That's not applying a debuff to me like it normally would because I'm immuning it. But on top of that, you're pretty much, unless you do some egregious movement here, I can't really picture a world where you end up missing the orbs. Now, if you happen to miss an orb, they eventually kind of blow up and expire, putting a dot on everyone. And so you obviously don't want to do that, but it doesn't seem hard not to, I guess. But yeah, having a nice big 3-target cleave means that, you know, my Death Strike is hitting all of these mobs really effectively. Blood Boil is more effective. Heart Strike's cleaving. This fight I actually really like a lot. It just seems kind of like a pushover, so I'd imagine that they might change it. Anyways, we're now moving into kind of like the last trash area. The trash is really heavy at the start of this dungeon, and it slowly lightens up, and then you're going from 3rd to 4th boss just by themselves. Like, it is just a back-to-back boss. And so you're going to want to make sure you have 100% count before you pull the 3rd boss, or you're going to have to do some backtracking, which you'll see us do at the end of this key, because I don't know percents yet, and I was just, messing around with stuff. A lot of the mobs, though, through this area are mobs that you've seen before outside of these void-infused destroyers. They don't do anything crazy. A little bit of AoE damage that's targeted onto players who have to spread out, and then they do this giant void cleave. You will have to face a lot of them in a kind of a forced way. There's 2 right before you jump down into the 2nd or the 3rd boss arena, and then there's 2 more you're going to have to pull in here. But almost everything else we've already seen through this portion, and then it's going to try to teach you the mechanics a little bit with these Shadow Weavers, these Grand Shadow Weavers. They spawn this orb here that then... it not only, I believe it pulsates damage, but if not, it shoots out these orbs, which you then obviously want to dodge, which you're going to see on the boss fight. Last but not least, we then have a double Grand Shadow Weaver pull. This pack's really weird because they're kind of guarding the final boss area, but you have to kill these mobs to activate the 3rd boss. So to me, their positioning feels weird in terms of activating the 3rd boss, but it's not that big of a deal. Once you know you have to pull them, you pull them. And besides dodging these orbs, which will be a boss mechanic, this pull seems pretty tame compared to these kind of double pulls that we've seen in the past of like double jump starter is pretty obnoxious in Floodgate, for example, or the doubled charged peacekeepers from like Motherlode in Season 2. You don't have these crazy hard mobs to deal with. They're just putting out a little bit of damage and putting out some orbs. So now we have Viceroy Nazar. This dude, same thing, spawns 2 of these orbs that will also then send out orbs in the directions of the little kind of like points. Then you have the mass void infusion, which targets 3 players, just dealing some damage. Healers are gonna have to counter this. You have a kick that you have to deal with, and then the big mechanic is Viceroy will spawn some tentacles, these umbral tentacles. Some of them are grouped. You can get a little RNG diff on this. Sometimes they're really nice and stacked like you see here. Sometimes they're way off on their own. The goal here is to try to kill these tentacles before he phases. The phase is happening in about 3 seconds. We're running over to try to get this umbral tentacle. I do have Death Advance going. And then there is a kind of a pushback knockback here that you're going to probably see when we get to the 2nd intermission that I don't have DA for. You're going to counter the wins, stack up, and then this is a little bit of like a healer check, intermission, make sure you're inside of the sphere. Really cool looking encounter design, I would say. Like the VX of this fight it's great. That phase can be a little punishing with the knockback, but here we go. We got some more orbs that are spawning, and this is the encounter. That's it. That is the full rotation. We're going to see pretty much the same thing again. I'm going to fast forward a little bit so you can see the knockback. So here we are finishing off the 2nd set of tentacles. Our mage did go down. I'm not paying attention to my runic power, so I'm trying to get him up. And then I'm knocked back without DA, so I'm getting pushed. It's a if you don't have a way to get through this wind, it can be a little scary. I'm going to start getting ticked here. I AMS, I get close, and then I battle res. But that's what the knockback generally looks like. As someone who normally plays Monk, I just counter this with things like roll, dashing with lighter than air, transcendence. But some other classes might struggle with that, trying to get back to the center. And then that's it. That's the fight. And then last but not least, we were looking good. If we had a little extra count going into the last boss with 7 to 8 minutes left, obviously would be really good. Now this boss seems a little bugged. Luara. And I guess I'll skip ahead a fair bit and talk about it. The problem with this fight, and let me just skip to the kill actually, maybe. So the way this boss works is that I'm assuming it's a she, but let's just say she spawns 6 of these like void crystals around the room. You'll see them off to my left and right above my party frame, and then off to the right hand side. And then you're going to get targeted with beams, and those targeted players will want to break them. Now, first, before that happens, you're going to have this disintegrate, which means you have to rotate around. And then we're going to get this lovely little sequence of this targeted mechanic. It's going to target 3 random players. It could be the tank, might not be. You then need to aim these at this different kind of void shards. Now, they should break said void shards, but sometimes, for some reason, they like reactivate, even despite getting hit, which shouldn't, from my understanding, shouldn't be the play. All right, really quick. Future Shah here, editing the video. I'm an idiot. So
I want to talk about how these void shards work. It looks like it's actually working correctly, and we're just bad. So what ends up happening is you pop 2 of them, right? So here's us kind of silencing those said shards. There's one behind the boss, one to my right. And then what's happening is right before the boss is these giant void circles on the ground, you're going to see them relocate right here. They're moving to new positions to kind of mix things up. I didn't realize this during the fight. I thought it was bugging out. I didn't really know what was going on. So yeah, that's where some of my confusion was coming from. And yeah, so feel free to make fun of me in the comments below. All right, back to whatever I was rambling about.
Maybe you're only allowed to break 2 at a time. Correct me if I'm wrong. It just seemed very inconsistent. Earlier on, we were wiping because despite aiming them at them, all 6 stayed active, and then we would just wipe. And so it was like, okay, what are we supposed to do here? So basically, your goal is to clear the room, because once you finish up these beams, it should start a kind of burn phase. Now, the one thing you'll notice is that we have 40 stacks of these debuffs that are kind of stacking up here. Every tick that those active shards are doing do ramping damage. Every time you get a stack of the debuff, it's going to deal more damage, so it's just ticking harder and harder and harder. So if you end up missing all of them, it's essentially just going to be a wipe. Now that I'm looking at this footage, it looks like you can only ever shatter 2 and then it'll just reactivate. So the goal here is to make sure you're targeting both, but I think we only end up targeting 1. Now, this could be a tactical play. We didn't do this on purpose, though, because we're just not really paying attention, I guess, or maybe don't know what's going on. But that means we're going to be in this phase 1 more time. And while we are taking a lot of damage, there's only 1 active shard, so the damage shouldn't be too oppressive. And then once we break that final shard, we're going to go into a nice big, I think it's 100% or 200% burn phase before starting the encounter over. So the goal for this last player, I'm going to move the boss nice and close, is you want to make sure you're lining yourself up. And just to be sure I was doing so, I actually moved right on top of it to know that I was actually going to shatter it, because up to this point, it looks like it was kind of bugged. So now we have Symphony of the Eternal Light. This is what happens when all of the little void shards that she has will erupt, do swirls, and then she is now currently recharging for 15 seconds or 20 seconds or something, and it's just a massive damage amp here. So this is where you're going to really want to try to push the boss into the dirt, and you're going to just start phase 2 over. Now, I do like damage burns. Normally, what you would do in the past is, like, if there ever is a damage burn on a boss, you'll generally hold Lust, but I think the harder part of the fight is obviously getting to this burn. So I think it depends on cooldowns, depending on Lust timings normally. So yeah, we'll have to see. But the fight does go down. We ended up wiping, I think, 2 or 3 times of this boss because of, like, just not hitting the shards or the bugged shards being Z-axis, not really sure. And so yeah, that was Seat of the Triumvirate. I'm not gonna lie, I'm actually way more positive about this dungeon after running it a few times. Like I said, the first couple times in here, I didn't know what the mechanics were. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know the pathing, the routing, etc. It's been a long time. It's been fairly reworked, I would say, from its original inception back in Legion. And I think it's going to be fun to kind of play around in here and get experimental. The only gripe that I have, and I don't think this will change, is I don't like killing Void Wardens. I don't really like those types of objectives in terms of routing. I do like the start of the dungeon. There's a lot of big pulls, not a ton of casters. And then I think the visuals on some of the mechanics are a little too purple, especially with how some of the environment detail looks. You have kind of purple flowers, you have like this kind of dark purple dirt, you have these like giant void cracks in the ground that are basically like purple and black. So when you have these kind of all layered on top of each other, it's a little difficult to see, but that was only really a problem at the start of the dungeon. The rest of it felt pretty good. It's a relatively linear with some options for rounding throughout the center, but overall, generally happy with it. But let me know what you guys think down below. Hopefully you enjoyed this quick little breakdown, and I will catch you all in the next one. Peace.